Savannah, Georgia, 1854. The wind carried the faint scent of the river that cut through Savannah, where moss-draped oaks leaned like old ghosts over the road. Dawn had only begun to break, and yet the plantation was already awake. The cotton fields stretched white and endless beneath the first light, rows upon rows that looked soft from a distance, like snow. But closer, they told stories of blood and broken backs. Chains clinked softly as Evelyn Johnson walked barefoot toward the big house. Her hands were steady. Her breath was not. The overseer marched beside her, his boots leaving deep prints in the dirt road while her lighter footsteps vanished beneath them. He didn't speak, he almost never did in the morning, but the whip curled in his hand said enough. On the veranda of the Davenport mansion, Margaret Davenport stood watching. Even at sunrise, she was adorned in pearls, as if afraid someone might forget she was a lady. Her expression held the same tightness as her corset attention that never seemed to loosen. Behind her, Isabel Davenport, 19 and hungry for admiration, twirled with excitement in a pale green morning dress. "It should be the finest this season," she declared. "The girls in Savannah will talk about it for months." Margaret nodded, eyes fixed on Evelyn. "See to it," she ordered coldly. As the missus wishes, Evelyn murmured, lowering her gaze. But behind those bowed lashes, fire smoldered. The overseer shoved Evelyn slightly to hurry her inside. She stumbled, but caught herself. She always caught herself. Inside the sewing room, sunlight filtered through tall windows upon tables cluttered with needles and spools of thread. Silks and lace imported from France lay folded like luxuries from another world, a world she dressed but would never belong to. The door shut behind her. Finally, silence. Her fingers reached for the fabric she would shape into Isabel's ball gown. A grand event was coming, one that would fill the house with carriages, violins, and laughter loud enough to drown out screams from the quarters. She smoothed the fabric out on the table. Her hands hovered and trembled, not from fear, from memory. A crib, empty, no goodbyes, just a bill of sale. Her daughter, little Sarah, only 8 years old, taken away 3 months ago to settle a gambling debt. Sold to a plantation somewhere in Mississippi. No way to know where. No chance of ever seeing her again. The needle between Evelyn's fingers glinted like a blade. A weapon no one would ever suspect. If they expected her to keep stitching beauty for the same people who tore her world apart, then they had underestimated the strength of a mother's grief. Evelyn inhaled deeply, grounding herself. The rage inside her tightened into something sharper, quieter, purposeful. She would not raise a hand to them. That would be too easy for them to punish. No, she would use what they valued most, the elegance they believed made them powerful. Her stitches would not only hold fabric together, they would unravel a dynasty. Outside, workers' cries echoed across the fields as the sun rose red and threatening. Evelyn pressed her thumb to the needle's point. A bead of blood surfaced dark, warm, alive. She whispered, barely a breath, "Sarah, I sew for you now." Her eyes lifted. No tears. Only resolve. Down the hall, the Davenports prepared for a season of glory. But in this room, in the quiet dawn of Georgia's richest soil, a rebellion was being threaded one stitch at a time. Life on Davenport Plantation moved with the cruel precision of a clock, each tick powered by hands that did not own their time. From sunup to sundown, the enslaved bent to the will of the land. Cotton was king, and the king demanded tribute, daily bleeding fingers, aching backs, and the lives of children who never lived long enough to remember freedom. Savannah's wealthy families liked to pretend this cruelty was tradition, something refined, justifiable, even noble. They spoke of Southern grace while bodies broke under the Carolina sun. They drank imported tea on porches built by those they refused to look in the eyes. Even within that twisted order, Evelyn's role was different. She did not toil in the fields. She did not cut or pick cotton under the overseer's watchful rage. No, her chains were softer, and in many ways, crueler. She worked where the smiles were false, where hatred hid behind lace curtains. In the big house, where a slip of the tongue could cost your breath, where a silent stare could mark your end. Some said Evelyn was lucky, but luck did not feel like this. Luck did not take your daughter away in the night and leave the crib cold forever. Luck did not make your skill the very rope they used to keep you silent. Thomas Davenport, the master, rarely spoke to Evelyn directly. He spoke of her instead like she was a prized tool. His wealth had grown in recent years, and he credited it to fine presentation. His wife Margaret loved to remind guests, "Our dresses are stitched by our own Negro seamstress hands, blessed by God himself, blessed." That word stung more than any whip, as if the same God had not heard Sarah scream while being dragged away. Margaret Davenport believed devastation could be hidden beneath seam and stitch. She believed beauty could erase the brutality that paid for it. She believed wrong. Days passed. Evelyn stitched, but every thread pulled tightened something inside her, the memory of Sarah calling Mama, the hollow promise they gave that it was for the good of the family, the knowledge that Sarah now belonged to strangers who saw her as livestock some nights. Evelyn pressed the small wooden doll Sarah once held to her chest, trying to imagine the warmth that used to fill the room. Now, that tiny figure was all she had left. The other enslaved knew better than to speak of such pain. But they saw it, felt it, rooted for it, even when terrified of the consequences. "Miss Evelyn," whispered Ruth, a young housemaid, during a rare moment alone, "you keep your head low, yes? They take in notice of how quiet you got since." She hesitated. Since Sarah, Evelyn didn't answer. Ruth stepped closer, voice shaking like leaves in a storm. "They say the Lord works in his time, but sometimes—" Her eyes searched Evelyn's. "We gotta help him along," Evelyn's heart pounded. Was that encouragement? Or a warning? Meanwhile, Savannah's social season approached. Invitations embossed in gold ink brought excitement to the big house. The Davenport name was printed proudly among the list of elite attendees. But none of that mattered compared to one event, the Whitford Ball. An opulent gala that would determine status, marriage prospects, and reputation for years to come. Isabel Davenport, valued jewel of the family, had her entire future pinned on that night. She believed a perfect dress would secure a wealthy husband, and respect among the daughters of the South. Margaret made her expectations brutally clear. "You will finish this gown before the week's end," she snapped at Evelyn. "It must be flawless. My daughter's future depends on it. Do you understand?" Evelyn nodded. "Yes, ma'am." But inside, she understood something far more dangerous. Their future depended on her hands, and her hands no longer served them. One evening, when the house finally slept, Evelyn slipped quietly from her quarters in the attic, bare feet gliding over creaking floorboards, down the stairs, through the parlor, into the sewing room. Moonlight fell across the half-finished gown, pale and ghost-like. She held the fabric between her fingers, imagining Sarah's skin instead. But this dress would never be innocent again. She reached beneath the work table and pulled out a folded cloth inside, leaves of poison ivy, gathered days earlier from the edge of the woods, where slaves whispered about freedom and fear in equal measure. To the unknowing eye, the plant was beautiful, soft, green. harmless, just like silk, just like the South claimed to be. Evelyn began to work, slow and steady, every stitch placed with intention, every hidden thread a promise, every fold a reckoning. This was not an act of impulse. It was strategy. It was justice. It was survival. One mother, one needle, one plan. And Savannah, still asleep under its illusion of control, had no idea what was coming. Evelyn worked for hours under the hush of the moon, stitching not just silk, but consequence. By dawn, the gown looked like perfection incarnate, smooth, radiant, fit for a young woman who had never felt hunger scrape at her ribs or fear tighten around her throat. But beneath its beauty, a different truth hid in the seams. Poison ivy's oils clear as water would not stain fabric. They would not betray her craft. They would wait, patient, merciless, and the skin they touched would remember. The next morning, Isabel rushed into the sewing room, unable to contain her excitement. "Oh, Evelyn, it's magnificent!" she squealed, lifting the gown with delicate fingers. "I knew you were special, special, not human, not mother, not grieving, just special, like a needle, like a tool." "Try it on," Margaret commanded, hovering close, eyes sharp with expectation. Evelyn stepped back, pulse steady, not too excited, not too afraid. Isabel slipped into the dress, twirled, admired herself in the mirror. The silk shimmered under the sunlight like a promise of glory. "It's perfect," she whispered. But Evelyn saw it the faintest reddening along Isabel's neck where the fabric grazed her skin. The start of a storm only one of them expected. Margaret clasped her hands together. "Tonight we feast. Tomorrow, the ball." Her smile stretched too wide. It never reached her eyes. As the day unfolded, the plantation buzzed with preparations. Footsteps raced through hallways. Servants polished silver until it gleamed. Musicians tuned their instruments in the parlor, strings vibrating like nerves. Outside, the enslaved dragged tables, lit lanterns, slaughtered chickens, every movement rehearsed under fear's choreography. Evelyn heard whispers. "Miss Isabel been scratching her arms. Hives, they say. Like fire under her skin." The missus lookin' worried. "She thinks spirits angry or something." Superstition and truth twined together like vines around rumor. The field workers did not look Evelyn in the eyes, but when they passed her, shoulders brushed hers intentionally. A silent salute, a recognition. Someone had finally done what they all dreamed of doing. But vengeance, Evelyn knew, was a serpent, coiled, watching, ready to strike both predator and prey. Ruth cornered her in the pantry while gathering plates. "What you do, Evelyn?" she hissed, eyes wide, afraid and curious all at once. Evelyn kept her gaze trained on the shelves. "I did what needed doing," she breathed. Ruth swallowed hard. "You can't bring Sarah back by hurting them." "No," Evelyn replied. "But I can make them feel something." Ruth's voice quivered, barely above a whisper. "Don't let hate be the only thing you got left." A silence fell between them, heavy as chains. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Hate is all they left me," she said. Ruth's hand trembled as she reached out, touching Evelyn's sleeve, trying to anchor her to something softer. But softness had become a luxury Evelyn could no longer afford. By afternoon, Isabel's irritation had worsened. Red patches bloomed across her collarbone and wrists. "Mother, it itches," she complained, her voice shrinking. Margaret waved away her concern. "It's nerves." "Now stop being dramatic," Isabel frowned, fingers clawing lightly. "I swear it burns. No." Margaret gripped her daughter's shoulders. "You will not ruin this. Not after everything I've invested. Another word like a knife. Evelyn stood quietly nearby, expression neutral. Margaret drew a sharp breath. "You fetch the bomb." "Yes, ma'am," Evelyn replied. She left the room, but not quickly. She paused just long enough to look back at Isabel's desperate scratching. A single thought flickered through her mind. This is what loss feels like. Sharp, constant, unbearable. Now, they would know it too. Night fell. Lanterns glowed along the mansion's facade like stars trapped in glass. Carriages lined the drive. Laughter and violins spilled out the open windows. The Davenport name shimmered on every lip, but Evelyn could feel the house breathing faster. Anxious, as if the walls knew something was unraveling. Margaret dragged Isabel to greet guests, ignoring the way the young woman twitched beneath her gown, how sweat beaded at her hairline, how panic swelled in her breath. Evelyn watched from the staircase, hidden in shadows. Every time Isabel smiled, her fingers dug deeper into her skin. Every dance left crimson trails along the silk. Every compliment was a countdown. The other enslaved workers noticed first. "Look, her neck, she's turnin' red like a devil's cloth. Something ain't right." The music tried to drown the truth, but Evelyn knew this was only the beginning. Because revenge was not a single stitch. It was a whole dress. And that dress was about to tear this plantation apart. The Whitford ball glittered like a jewel in the heart of Savannah. Carriages kept arriving, wheels crunching over gravel as chandeliers cast golden halos across polished floors. Laughter spilled from the grand double doors, drowning out the moans of workers unloading trays from the back. Inside, Isabel Davenport stood at the center of it, all the dress Evelyn created hugging her form like a second skin. From afar, she looked radiant. Up close, she was unraveling. Her fingers scratched relentlessly at her arms, her neck, her back, anywhere the silk touched. But the music was loud, the eyes upon her many, and pride was a merciless captor. "You look divine, Isabel, like a flower in full bloom. What a glorious gown! Glorious! If only they knew it bloomed beneath." Meanwhile, Margaret floated through the room with the poise of a queen, certain of her power. "Do you see?" she whispered to Thomas Davenport. "She will leave this ball a bride." Thomas nodded, satisfied but unaware that their world was starting to itch and burn. The string quartet played a waltz as Isabel stepped onto the floor with the son of a prominent judge, a planned match, whispered about for months. She smiled as they turned, but every rotation made the seams press harder against her skin. The irritation that had begun as a whisper now screamed across her body like wildfire. Her breath shortened. Her composure crumbled. "Isabel?" the young man asked, confusion flickering in his eyes. She tried to hold in the panic, but pain broke her discipline. With a choked gasp, she reached behind her neck, nails raking hard. The skin broke. Blood beaded. A nearby woman shrieked. The waltz faltered. A hush swept the ballroom like a cold wind. Isabel stumbled back, clutching her burning arms, skin blotched and swollen. "What's happening to me?" she cried, voice cracking. Margaret rushed forward, face draining of color as she saw the angry red welts. "Control yourself," she hissed, desperate to maintain dignity. But dignity was beyond saving. Isabel's agony could no longer be hidden. She tore at the gown-ripping seams, exposing raw, blistered flesh. Gasps filled the room. Some stared in horror. Others crossed themselves, whispering of curses or judgment. Margaret stood frozen, a statue shattering from the inside. And then Isabel collapsed. Chaos ignited. Guests scattered from the ballroom like startled deer. The judge's son shouted for a doctor. Someone screamed for prayer. Margaret held Isabel's trembling body, tears streaming not from concern but humiliation. "She's cursed," a woman cried. "A hex upon the house. The devil walks among us." Thomas Davenport stormed toward the exit, barking orders. "Find the cause. Check the food, the water. Find whoever did this." But even as he commanded, his gaze snapped toward one figure in the distance, Evelyn, standing perfectly still near the servants' stairs. Hands clasped, eyes calm, watching. Thomas's face twisted into fury. "You," he growled, advancing toward her. Evelyn did not run. She did not bow. She only lowered her chin slightly, acknowledgement, not obedience. "I tend to my duties, sir," she said, voice steady. But Thomas had already decided. "The dress," he spat. "You touched it. You made it." "You," Margaret cut in, wild with panic. "She must be punished. At once." Isabel whimpered, her nails still clawing flesh. The doctor tried to restrain her to no avail. This was no mere rash. This was suffering with purpose. Evelyn was seized, rough hands gripping her arms. Ruth, watching from the shadows, pressed trembling fingers to her lips. As they dragged Evelyn into the hallway, Thomas snarled. "You thought you could hide it." He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look him in the eye. "You thought we wouldn't see you." Evelyn stared back without fear. "You never see us," she whispered. Those 5 words struck harder than any whip. But Thomas didn't care for revelations. "Lock her up," he commanded. "We'll deal with her at dawn." The overseer yanked Evelyn away, but as she was pulled through the servants' corridor, she caught sight of Ruth, of the field hands peering through the back door, of frightened eyes suddenly glimmering with something new. Not terror, not pity, hope. Because for the first time in years, pain belonged to the powerful, and freedom, even whispered, had taken root. That night, while the big house shook under the weight of shame and fear, Evelyn smiled. A small smile, a dangerous one. The kind that says, "This is only the beginning." The night swallowed the plantation whole. Inside a small stone room beneath the servants' quarters, Evelyn sat chained to a wooden chair. The lantern on the table flickered wildly, throwing shadows that twisted like restless spirits along the walls. Thomas Davenport paced before her, fists clenched, jaw ticking with rage. Margaret stood in the corner, arms crossed, face swollen from crying, or perhaps from pride collapsing inward. "You brought shame upon our family," Thomas spat. "You brought shame upon the South," Margaret added, venom dripping. Evelyn did not look at either of them. She stared at the floor, silent, unbroken. Thomas slammed his fist against the table. "You'll confess what you did to my daughter." Evelyn finally looked up, eyes burning quietly. "What I did?" She echoed. "You sold my child like cotton on a cart. Tell me, who confesses that crime?" Margaret gasped, clutching her pearls as though Evelyn's truth were the true obscenity. Thomas leaned close enough that she could smell the bourbon on his breath. "You think one dress gives you power?" He sneered. "Tomorrow they'll watch you pay for this. Every slave on this plantation will remember what happens to those who forget their place." Evelyn met his gaze with steady, terrifying calm. "They already remember," she whispered. Thomas's eyes wavered because he knew it was true. Outside, in the quarters, word of Evelyn's capture spread like fire through dry brush. No one slept. Men stood in the shadows, fists clenched. Women held their children close, whispering hope like a forbidden prayer. Ruth slipped from cabin to cabin with a message breathed through cracks in doors. Dawn. The whipping post. They'll make us watch, but the enslaved did not tremble like before. Something had shifted. If Evelyn could strike a blow, so could they. An older man, once known for silence, finally spoke. She did what we all been too scared to do. Heads nodded. Eyes hardened. Feet prepared to move. Rebellion had been a rumor. Now it had a face. Meanwhile, inside the locked room, Margaret stepped forward, her voice tight and cracking. Why? Why target my daughter? Her voice trembled between anger and desperation. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Because you love her, she answered. The honesty in her tone cut deeper than hatred ever could. You love her. The way I love Sarah, Margaret froze. And for the first time, she understood. Loss. Fear. A mother's heart shattering. Her mask slipped just for a breath before she clamped it back into place. That's not the same, she whispered weakly. It's exactly the same, Evelyn replied. Suddenly, a pounding at the door. The overseer stepped inside, his face pale. Master Davenport. The workers. They're gathering. The whole lot of 'em, Thomas cursed under his breath. Savages. I'll put them back in place myself. Evelyn leaned back against the chair, a slow smile rising. You taught them fear, she said softly. Now they've learned something stronger. Thomas ignored her, barking orders. Get the rope. At dawn she hangs. Margaret flinched, truly startled. Hang. Thomas, that is justice. He roared. But Margaret's voice cracked. That is. Dangerous. Evelyn closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. The darkness didn't frighten her anymore. She could feel Sarah in every breath. She could feel her ancestors in the pulse beneath her skin. She had already changed the world. Whether she lived or died, they would never forget her. In the stillness, she whispered to herself not a prayer, but a promise. Carry me home, Lord. Carry me home. Not even chains could silence a mother's song. And outside, beyond these walls, the enslaved stepped forward together. Not as property, not as shadows, as a people. Ready. Dawn was coming. But the Davenports would soon learn. Not all dawns belong to those who think they control the light. Before the first hint of sunlight touched the fields, the plantation was already awake, but not with work. With waiting. Dozens of enslaved workers stood gathered near the whipping post. The air felt thick, like the sky itself held its breath. Torches burned along the yard, their flames dancing with the tension. Evelyn was dragged through the door of the stone room, wrists bound, shoulders squared. The overseer shoved her forward, but her steps did not falter. If this would be her final walk, she would make it one worth remembering. Thomas Davenport approached, rope in hand, rage carved into every line of his face. His daughter had spent the night feverish and sobbing, and now humiliation demanded sacrifice. Look upon your punishment, he bellowed, forcing every enslaved man, woman, and child to witness. But their eyes did not lower. Not today. Ruth was near the front of the crowd, hands shaking not from fear, but resolve. The others stood close, forming a wall of silent defiance. Thomas threw the rope over the wooden beam. Death was only heartbeats away. Margaret appeared on the veranda, pale and trembling. Guilt flickered across her like a candle-fighting wind. But she said nothing. Silence claimed the yard until a single voice broke it. Stop. A man stepped forward, tall, eyes fierce. Josiah, a field hand known for his quiet strength. You lay one hand on her, and you fight all of us. Thomas froze. The overseer reached for his whip, but several men moved closer, boxing him in with bodies hardened by labor and loss. Ruth stepped out. Then another. Then dozens more. One by one, they advanced, not attacking, not threatening, simply refusing to kneel. Thomas looked around, and for the first time in his life, fear crawled into his bones. "Back to your quarters," he roared, voice cracking. No one moved. Evelyn turned her head, meeting the eyes of her people, and in them she finally saw it. Not pity, not sorrow. Freedom. Even if just for this moment. A whistle pierced the tense dawn. Horses. Lanterns bobbing near the edge of the woods. A wagon rolled into view, covered, discreet, driven by a woman with skin pale as moonlight and courage burning brighter than fire. Her signal came again, 2 whistles short, 1 long. The Underground Railroad. Ruth gasped, hope blooming so fast it almost hurt. "Go," she whispered. "Run." Thomas lunged for Evelyn, but Josiah blocked him, shoving him back into the dust. Evelyn sprinted, chains biting into her wrists, heart pounding like thunder, every step a prayer. The overseer shouted for the guards, but the enslaved swarmed the space, creating a living shield. Evelyn reached the wagon. Hands pulled her inside. The woman cracked the reins and wheels spun into motion. Shots rang out. Dirt erupted near the wheels, but the wagon vanished into the trees, swallowed by the forest and the promise of freedom. The plantation shrank behind Evelyn. The big house, once towering, grew smaller, pathetic. She didn't look back. Days later, in a safe house far from Savannah, Evelyn stood beneath a northern sky, one unburdened by plantation smoke. She held a small wooden doll in her hand. Sarah's doll. "I'll find you, baby," she whispered. "Wherever they took you, I'll find you." A gentle voice answered behind her, "You will, and we'll help you." Evelyn turned. Dozens of others stood waiting to travel north, each with their own story carved in scars. But tonight, Evelyn's voice would guide them, with needle and song, with memory and fire. She looked toward the horizon, where sunlight broke through the clouds like a revelation, and she smiled. Not the smile of a servant, not the smile of someone afraid. The smile of a woman who had made the South tremble with nothing but her hands. Back on Davenport Plantation, a new silence reigned. A silence that accused. A silence that remembered. Isabel refused to wear silk again. Margaret avoided mirrors. Thomas doubled the patrol. But fear had already entered through the seams. Because news traveled, stories spread. And one story spread faster than any whip could silence. The seamstress who stitched freedom into silk and slipped justice into the finest halls of the South. Her name whispered like a hymn, Evelyn Johnson. And her thread, just like her legacy, would never break.